Okay, we're in the fifth parak of Bava Basra. I wanted to start tonight, um, discuss discuss a very famous Inyan that is brought in on Daf Ayin Gimel. We're in the midst, if you remember, of the fourth, fifth, and sixth parak of this Masechta. Discuss Dinei Mechira, the laws of commerce, of buying and selling, what's included, what's not included. So the Mishnah innocently starts off by talking about the sale of a boat. So it discusses what's included. It says Hamocher Sasfina Mandaf Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph. Hamocher Sasfina, Mocher Satorin, Vesa Nes, Vesa Ugin, Ves Kol Hamanhigin. Right? What's included? The oars and the mast and the sail and the anchor and all of the accoutrements that accompany the boat. But what's not included are items such as the people and and the business and the side business, things that are not literally attached to the boat. Okay, so that's the way the Mishnah begins. And just as an agav, I was thinking there are several discussions in Shas regarding boat per se. It's a being that they were the very important in back then in the world of commerce. So I was making mental notes. I know that there's 5 halachic discussions I could think of regarding boats, right? If you remember the Gemara in Shabbos, I believe it's the first parak around Daf Tez Vav, Daf Tezayin, somewhere around there, discusses about how many days before Shabbos you're allowed to go on a cruise, right? And if you're allowed to get off on Shabbos, the whole tchum discussion is one halacha regarding boats. Second halacha regarding boats is at the end of Eruvin, where it discusses how to draw water out of a boat on Shabbos if you need to draw water, regarding the Rishus, from Rishus Yachid, like what are you considered? Are you Rishus Yachid, taking water out of Rishus Rabim? Is it a Simta? So that whole discussion about Eruvs, we'll call it, is found in Eruvin. Then, of course, we have the sale of a boat, which is a few days ago, which is Daf Ayin Gimel, what's included in the sale. And I believe on yesterday's Daf, we had a machlokes about how to acquire a boat. Okay, regarding, if you remember, Rav and Shmuel were discussing how much you have to pull it. You have to pull it a little bit so that it moves. And the last one, this is the trivia question, we had a discussion back in April in Daf Yomi land, in Ezehu Neshech, remember, regarding a boat, regarding if you're allowed to charge, it's called Agra Upagra, if you're allowed to charge rent and depreciation, right? Because it's talking about ribis. If you have a boat rental company and you rent out the boats, right, can you, along with your rental, charge also for the loss of value, or what we call depreciation, of the boat? So that's also a discussion. So there's 5 discussions about boats, and we're about to discuss now on today's daf the main course, because the side course is just the discussion about what's included in the sale. The Gemara goes off on a wild tangent about 3 daf worth, which is what they call the Agadata of Rabba Babarchana. And I'd like to go out on a limb, and in my humble opinion, I would say it's probably not the top 3 or 4, most famous agaritas. I would call it probably the most famous agaritas if you had to rank them, or in today's world, they call it the GOAT, greatest of all time. And I think, and I believe the reason why I would call it the greatest of all time, or the most famous agaritas of all time, is because there are no less than, I heard this a couple of weeks ago, there are at minimum 30 Sfarim over the centuries that were written just on this Agadata. I can't think off the top of my head of famous Agadatas that had their own sefer written about. We have sugyas and shas, like Takfa Kohen, or there are various, lomdisha, as we call them, sugyas that have their own, that may have their own books, their own svarim, because there's so much to discuss written about them. But this, I heard, there are somewhere between 30 and 50 svarim that are written just about the stories of Rabba Bar Chana. So I would certainly, take that as as an indicator of just how exciting or important this Agadata that we are about to see, or just maybe the introduction, just to even talk about it, deserves its own shear. So just regarding Agadata, I mean, there's so many things to talk about, but I came across a very interesting, very early source about Agadatas, right? I'd say Shas is maybe between 30 to 35% of Agadatas, but how does the Gemara view it vis-a-vis, your conventional, Gemaras like we've had over the last couple of months in Bava Basra, where it's very, very, deep and intricate and, laws, and then you have, some story time for a couple of days. But how does the Gemara view Agadata? So I came across a piece. I'll start off this way from Maseches Sofrim. Okay, Maseches Sofrim, for those who may not know, are one of those what we call minor tractates. Okay, those are those very short Gemaras. They're not really Gemaras. They're more like halachas that are all the way in the back of, I believe, most versions of Maseches Avodah Zarah, where they give you like just rules and regulations of a specific topic. So there's actually a whole Masechta on Sofrim, the rules and regulations of being a Sofer. People out there in the audience might have an idea or two how to be a good Sofer. And all the way at the end of Masechta Sofrim, in the 16th, I'm not sure what it's called, chapter, it says, Amr Yehoshua ben Levi, Hada Agadata, Kasav ba Hakosva, Ein lo chelok la'olam haba. V'hadorsha misbarech, v'hashoma eino makabel schar. Now, what does that mean in English? Rabbi Yehoshua ben Levi said, regarding Agadata, he who writes it down has no share in the world to come. He who expounds it is cursed, while he who listens to it receives no reward. All right, I think this is an awesome introduction to the Agadata of Rabba Bar Chana. If I could pick one source amongst dozens, if not hundreds, I love this source. I'm lucky I found it. It's tucked. It's an obscure, like I said, Maseches Sofrim. And the question is, why is Maseches Sofrim so against writing Agadata, listening to Agadata, learning Agadata? I mean, this is quite, in fact, it's a little bit ironic because this sounds like Agadata, only because it's going a little overboard. And anytime we come, to exaggerations in the Talmud, we always say, it doesn't really mean what it says. It's right, like the number 60, like the number 70, like the number 300, as we're going to see, right? So it talks about someone who writes Agadata has no chelik l'olam haba. So there's an interpretation that's called Tosfos, at least. It's called Tosfos on that, and I'm going to read you why Tosfos believes that Maseches Sofrim is very against learning Agadata. V'hadorsha mitoch haksav. Okay, so Ken Kasav Harav Nachlas Yaakov, Ken Kasav Harav Yafa Mara, Amnam Harav Haradvaz, Zal B'tshuva, Haniskar Mefarish Kipshata Dorsha Afilu Baal Peh. Even learning it Baal Peh, forget about writing it down. Because again, there's Torah Shabbal Peh, there's Torah Shabbal, right? That's what this is referring to, someone who actually writes down, because you're not ideally supposed to write down Torah Shabbal Peh. So it's one thing if you want to write down halachos, because you're going to forget them. That's the whole concept, right, of Eis Lasos and why we have Gemara. So here's the reason. The time of Ta'im she'ikar ha'agada hi sodos ne'elamim, because it's things that are way, as they say, above our pay grade, secrets, deep secrets, hidden secrets. Ukafi pshuta hashomea yite. Okay, someone listening to it is going to make a mistake. Ukiyotze, itzarach lemosra pe'el pe v'herich harbe bazeh. He says, because it's very easy to misunderstand, and when you misinterpret things, right, like the game of telephone, after transmitting it to a couple of people, the whole thing comes out wrong, and it's going to end up in a absolute disaster. So we do what we can to eliminate the learning, okay, at least eliminate the learning of Agadita, okay, and this specific Agadita of Rabba Bar Chana is a prime example of the Talmud on trial. Okay, we know that over the centuries, the Ramban, Pablo Cristiani, over the centuries, the Talmud has been on trial. That's a known fact. And I'm about to read to you a source from Rab Shlomo ibn Virga. I don't know who that is. Somewhere in the mid-1400s, he wrote a sefer called Shevet Yehuda. I'm going to read it in Hebrew because that's where I saw the source. Mita'er vikuach ideologi ben hanotrim la Yehudim be'inyan haTalmud. There's an ideological debate between the Notzrim, between the Christians and the Jews regarding the Talmud. Mukad ha'hitmodudut b'vikuach zeh hu agadat Rabba Bar Chana. And at the core of this debate was exactly this Gemara in Bava Basra that we're going to look at. Umikan ratzon lahasik maskanot temuhot al haTalmud kulo. And the debater wanted to basically come to the conclusion that none of this Talmud could be believed. Okay? Vikuach haya ben ish notzri ben ish Yehudi, between a Catholic and a Jew. Lifnei HaMelech Don Alfonso in Portugal. I looked him up. Don Alfonso V was the king in Portugal from 1420 to 1470 or so. And according to what I saw, I think he was the king right before Ferdinand, or maybe two before, I'm not exactly sure. But in the mid-1400s, the king of Portugal was named Don Alfonso V. He officiated. Okay? Amar HaMelech, Yesh li al hadvarim ha'ela hasagot, aviyem b'sof inyanenu, v'ani omer shekivan sheminak shelachem lomar divrei sheker v'shav, since you Jews talk lies all the time, kvar hu chazaktem l'shakranim b'chol davar. Okay? It sounds like you lie here, you lie everywhere. V'ani shamati b'vikuach echad, shatam omrim b'talmud shalachem. I heard once that somewhere in your Talmud, you bring down a crazy story. You talk about frogs that are the size of 60 homes. And if you think that that frog was big, an alligator or some kind of creature swallowed that up. And a raven came, right? This sounds like the Chagadia. The raven came and ate up that tanin. Va'oratem omrim shebiyama ukenos, an Atlantic Ocean, nafal barzel, an axe fell, v'niskalgal zayin shanim below yared lakarka. Right? Now all this should be familiar because this is all the daf from a few days ago. So these details in all of the 21 stories, this king is actually bringing up as proof that we're just full of baloney, that all these things are ridiculous. And it's funny, he says, why is it not believed that an axe could fall in an ocean and not land for 7 years? Mira yam im, you already know, right? This is also something we should have asked, right? Who was there underwater to actually see whether or not, right? You have to believe, you have to have blind faith, right? So who was actually there to see whether or not this axe actually fell to the bottom of the ocean? We don't know. And also you have, all these stories about that there's waves and there's 300 parsas between each wave. That's ridiculous. Forget about the distance, can't be 300. The whole Yam itself is not even 300 parses big. So this is the debate. This is the, so to speak, the complaint that was lodged against the Jew. So here's the Tshuvat HaYehudi. Kasvu ktsas min avonei lev shehakadmonim hayu min hagam. So the way the Jew answered was what the minhag was, kisher yirtzu lekarav ha'am sheyishmu divreim, when the wise men called people over, okay, to give them, speeches, to give them musar shmuzes. Hayulokhin naval umenagim. They would take musical instruments and play, right? Ukisha'am karav la'arvut hanigun az hayu omrin masha nira lahem letaken haseder hamedini v'hayashrid hanishama. They would ease them into the program. It's like kind of reminds me of, these slichas programs where you have to, where you play music, and right before the very, before slichas, you want to ease them into it. So they have these programs where they play music, and you like kind of ease into it. But in the places where they didn't know how to play music, they had to figure out a different way to ease the people into the speech that the rabbi wanted to give. So they put on, like, what today, you have a charity fundraiser, so you'll have a mentalist, right? You'll have a comedian, right? And then you have, like, the big speeches at the end, like the serious speeches. But you want to ease the crowd, right, a little bit into it. So you speak nicely to them. You do something, what we call light, some light entertainment. This, says the Jew, is our light entertainment. We'll give them a story. We'll talk about giant frogs and all kinds of weird, sea gemaras. But those who know really know that it's just a mashal. Okay, so basically that's the way he answered, is don't take it seriously. It's just our way of what we'll call, light entertainment. So let's look at several introductions to how the early Rishonim view these stories that we've seen. Okay, we're going to look at it through the eyes of the Rashbam, the Maharsha, and the Ritva. Okay, so, and then we're going to, of course, do a little bit of analysis on all of them. But I'm going to read the Rashbam for 1 second, and then we'll get back to it. The Rashbam says, regarding these stories that we are going to see, let me read it. Kol hani uvde de kachashuv mishum marabu masacha Hashem. All of these stories that we're about to read are to show, like the pasuk says in Tehillim, marabu masacha Hashem, umehen lahodia matan scharin shel tzadikin la'asad lava, and to show, the great reward that tzaddikim are eventually going to get. Oh, he says, or lefarish mikros ha'amuros b'sefer Iyov, hamedabros ba'ofos gedolim u'behemos b'dagim gedolim shekol sichas talmidei chachamim tzricha talmud. Or we have to substantiate these psukim in Iyov that you may or may not know about, where it talks about giant sea creatures and giant land mammals, to show you that yes, they exist. And here is proof from Rabbi Baruch Hanan. Okay, that is the introduction of the Rashbam. The introduction of now, we're going to have this debate whether these stories are literal on one side, or on the other side, they are the opposite. They are completely fictional. And then there's somewhere in the middle. And, we all know that this shouldn't be different than any other Gemara where we have a varying, a wide range of opinions. So we're going to see that different, Rishonim fall into different category. But if you were scoring at home, you would already say that the Rashbam, in the words of the Rashbam, he says this is no joke. He says this is exactly to show you Ma Rabu Masecha Hashem. So he is in the literal camp. Okay, says the Ritva. Yesh b'masiyot shebeperek ze inyanim zarim livnei adam. All right. Today's, what's the big word today in the news? In politics? Weird, right? So that's exactly the way the Ritva describes the word zar is weird or strange. The Ritva warns us, he says, you're going to read about strange stories, things that we're not accustomed to. Okay? So how do we deal with it? Right? These are natural things. Regarding the large fish and the creatures and these enormous waves. So here we have a little bit more of a, let's call him a rationalist, right? Like maybe like the Rambam would say, and there are details in the story. You see, he's already moving from the opinion of the Rashbam. There are details in the story that he saw that are only a remez, and you couldn't actually see it. He saw that in a chalom, in a dream. Okay? When you go out in the ocean, you see wonders. They're all out there by themselves in the water, and they see all kinds of crazy, right, miracles. Right? What are dreams made of? Dreams are made of what you see. Right? How many times you see a show at night, late at night, and you dream about it, right? You usually dream about the last thing on your mind. So you can't fault, right, these chachamim for explaining what they saw, but again, in the eyes of the Ritva, it was more in a dream world. Okay? Okay, then he says, he brings in other interpretations. Okay, so that at least is the opinion of the Ritva. I would like to read the words of the Maharsha. Okay, now we all know that when it comes to Agadata in Shas, the go-to guy in the back of the Gemara is the Maharsha. Okay, maybe 20-30% of all the Marshas in Shas are dedicated to Agadata, and the Maharsha usually interprets, like, for example, we've discussed the various Gemaras that appear twice, one in Avodah Zarah and one in Masechah Shabbos, regarding the Refuah Gemaras, right? We all know that there's 3 daf in Shabbos, and I think 2.5 blot in Avodah Zarah in the second parak that discuss home remedies. And the Maharsha is very big into don't do it, don't believe it. It's something that we don't understand. We don't have the ingredients anymore. The Maharsha gives you all the caveats in the world to not take it literally. Here, to the astonishment of many who would think otherwise, the Maharsha says, "Afki be'emes ein lahakrish pashtei hadvarim." He says right off the bat, you cannot, right? Like we have the expression we've said many times, "Ein hamikra yotze midei pshuto." The Maharsha says you absolutely have to learn these stories like it is Torah Misinai. Every single thing happened. You cannot be makrish it. You can't contradict it. And he brings a pasuk. K'moshe kasuv yordei hayam ba'aniyot osei malacha b'mayim rabim hema ra'u maseh Hashem. Okay, we're going to look at that pasuk soon. The teromim galav yalu mikol makom yesh kan dvarim bago. However, there's a big but. The big but is there are things that are a little bit above our understanding, very, very deep. Binyan tzutzisa denura, like the fire, right? The waves that have white fire, and hitting the waves in the name of God and all of these things and the 300 parsas. He says, Gam rachok me'inyano, sheyomar gal lechavero, that one wave could talk to another wave. All right, and the second wave is going to answer. Okay, she'en lahem ratzon u'bechira, right? There's no ratzon u'bechira. So that has to be learned separately on a different level. However, and this is really the highlighted bottom line of the Marsha, is do not discount the Pashat Pshat of the story. Okay, so let's analyze the Rashbam. The Rashbam, if you remember, said, what are we doing? We're looking at these stories because what's the pasuk he quoted? He quoted the pasuk of Marabu Masecha Hashem. Now, I happen to like this pasuk. One of the reasons why I like this pasuk is because we say it in davening. Okay, if you remember, we say it twice in davening, which is very rare to say one pasuk twice in davening. Okay, we say it in Hameir La'aretz V'Odim Aleha because we're talking about what? We're talking about the creation of the sun and the moon, right? The Ma'oros, and Yotzer HaMa'oros is a creation. So we are saying Marabu Masecha Hashem. The other time we say it happens to be from my favorite parak in Tehillim, which is 104, otherwise known as Baruchi Nafshi. Okay, I'm going to read the pasuk for those of you who don't know it. It says, Marabu Masecha Hashem, Kulam b'chachma asita malah haaretz kinyanecha, zeh hayam gadol u'rachab yadayim, sham remes ve'in mispar, chayos ktanos im gedolos. Okay. How many are your things, O Lord? The sea is vast and wide, with its creatures beyond number, living things small and great. Okay. And here's the punchline. Sham anios yahalechu leviasan ze yatzarta lesachek bo. Oh, so we're talking about boats, right? Boats and ships go in the water, and the Leviathan, which we're not going to talk about, we had that on Daf Ayin Hey. If you remember, we had a whole blot a couple days ago devoted just to the Leviathan. I think it's just a little bit too much to talk about everything, but that's a topic by itself. Okay, God created the Leviathan to play with, whatever that means. But do see that this pasuk is referring to our tefillah, right? It connotes the Ma'oros, and it also comes into play regarding the creation of the Yam Hagadol, which the boats go on. That's the biblical, that's the scriptural version based in Tehillim of what Marabu Masecha Hashem. Okay? Now, where does this pasuk come up in Shas, Marabu Masecha Hashem? It actually comes up in Meseches Chulin. Meseches Chulin, Daf Kuf Pav Zayin. The Gemara says as follows, okay? We are talking about animals. Obviously, in Chulin, most of Chulin talks about animals. And the Gemara makes a comment on Daf Kuf Chav Zayin. By the way, this is the second week in a row we have Kuf Chav Zayin. Remember last week we had Shabbos Kuf Chav Zayin regarding the story of Rabbi Akiva and Dan Lekav Schus, if you remember. So here's Chulin Daf Kuf Chav Zayin. The pasuk says, the pasuk in Shmini is talking about the Shmona Shrotzim, right? Hacholad v'ha'achbar v'hatzav l'minehu. Okay, so the Gemara says v'hatzav l'minehu lahavi ha'orud v'chen hanafilim v'salamandra. Okay, this is a little bit obscure, but it's very interesting. What is the tzav? So the tzav is one of the shrotzim. It's actually a machlokas, whether it's a toad, or whether it's a frog, whether it's a turtle. We don't know exactly what it is, but it's one of the big 8 shrotzim that are mitamin. And the Gemara says that we could include, okay, something called an arvad, which is a type of snake, the chen hanaphilim, and also some kind of an animal that's called an aphilim, not to be confused with the giants and bracious, the salamandra and the salamander. Okay? Ukishahaya Rabbi Akiva Magila Pasuk Zeh, right? And when Rabbi Akiva would reach this pasuk in Tehillim of Ma Rabu Masecha Hashem, he would say, Yesh Lacha Brios Gedolos Biyam, Yesh Lacha Brios Gedolos Biyabasha. We have large land animals and we have large sea mammals. Shebiyam ilmala olos biyabasha miad mesos, and sheyabasha ilmala yordos liyam miad mesos. And God, in His infinite wisdom, created two kinds of systems where fish, aside, we're not going to talk about whether whales are mammals or not, that's more of an exception, but for the most part, fish can't live out of water, and human beings cannot live outside of land. As soon as one leaves this domain, they die right away. Okay, that in the world of Rabbi Akiva was unbelievable. That qualified as Marabu Masacha Hashem. How you could have two different kind of living creatures that cannot coexist in the same environment. That itself is a hafla b'fela in the world of Rabbi Akiva. And he goes on to say, now, by the way, what is a salamander? We don't have enough time to talk about it, but that's a very interesting discussion. What kind of salamander we're talking about? But Rabbi Akiva hints to it because he says, Yesh lacha brios gedolos ba'or, v'yesh lacha brios gedolos ba'avir. Creatures are created out of avir, and then there are creatures that are created out of fire. There was a belief that a salamander, a certain species of salamander, was created from fire. And if you remember the Gemara all the way at the end of Chagiga, talks about it. We're not talking about it now, but anyways, that is the discussion about Marabu Masecha Hashem vis-a-vis animals. And we see how that ties in, because all these stories that we may not even get to by now are all animal. For the most part, are all fish and birds and frogs and right, they're all animal related. So that's Marabu Masech Hashem. When you think of Marabu Masech Hashem, you think of animals, okay, of crazy, like everyone loves to say during a safari. I don't know if you've ever been to a safari. Everybody gets all religious when they see, right, when they see the hyena kill and when they see the lion and all these animals that you don't get to see. Right, that's when you start, saying Marabu Masecha Hashem. What about people? Right, does this apply to people? So what if you see, I don't know, let's say a beautiful woman, okay, in the subway? Do you say Marabu Masecha Hashem? So most people would say, how could you even talk about such a thing like that? So that's why we have Maseches Avodah Zarah Daf Chaf. Okay, ready for this? Ma'aseh Rab Shimon ben Gamliel Shahaya al Gabe Mala Baharabayis. Rab Shimon ben Gamliel was what we would call today near Temple Mount. Okay, we all know where that is. V'ra'a avodos kachavim achas na'e biyoter, and he saw a Gentile woman who was beautiful. Amar Marabu Masecha Hashem, and he said Marabu Masecha Hashem. Wow, this is the second place and the last place in Shas where this pasuk is quoted. Okay, he's saying it over a person, and he's saying it over a beautiful lady. You would think, oh my God, how in the world could you say it? Over a non-Jew? Well, that's a little debatable, but I think the less debatable part is it's a rabbi saying it over a beautiful woman. So the Bavli Avodah Zarah and Masechet Avodah Zarah has no problem with this Gemara. Okay? Who does have a problem with this Gemara? There's a Yerushalmi. Okay? The Yerushalmi says as following. Ma'aseh b'Rabban Gamliel. First of all, it's not Rab Shimon ben Gamliel, it's Rabban Gamliel. Okay, that's one side note. Is that important or not? Not for now. Shahaya mitayel b'harabayis. He was walking by the Temple Mount. V'ra isha achas goya ubirech aleha. And he saw a beautiful Gentile woman and said a blessing over her. Just like our Bavli, or close enough. Says the Yerushalmi v'chidarko shel Rabban Gamliel lahabit benashim, as they say, pasnisht, right? You're making a bracha over a beautiful woman? So the Yerushalmi has to say, Ella derech akmumios haisa. You don't know what was going on. He was walking, and the road was curved, and he had no choice. Shehebitba shelo betuvasa ubirachaleh. He had no choice. He was going around the curve, and bam, he lifted his eyes, and there she was, and he saw her, and he had to say a bracha. Very nice. That reminds me, by the way, of the Rashi in Tetzava, where it talks about the Sinar, right? The Choshen, that the woman on the horse. So everybody used to ask, how does Rashi know what a woman on a horse looks like? So there's some legendary story about Rashi, who saw a horse with a woman, and he said, that's why I woke up today to see a woman wearing this beged that reminded him of one of the begadim that the Kohen Gadol wore. Okay. Anyways, so getting back to that, so what did he do? So he had no choice but to say a bracha. Okay. So Ma Amar, Lo Amar Ella Baruch Shakach Lo Birios Naos Ba'olam. O Sheken Ra Filu. So what bracha did he say? Okay. He said the bracha of Baruch Shekach Lo Birios Naos Ba'olam. Okay. Now we know we're not going to get into this, but there's the Gemara in Brachos, I think Nun Hey or so, talks about all the various brachas you say. You say Mishana Habrios when you see these weird animals, right? Things that you've never, right? These uncommon things that people say. There are special brachas that you say, but the bracha that he said was Shekachlo Birios Naos Ba'olamo Sheken Ra Filu Chamorna O Gamel Snae Susna Omer. He says, because a woman, and I'm saying this a little tongue-in-cheek, can't be any worse than a chamor or a gamal or a sus. So if you'd say a bracha on seeing a beautiful, donkey or camel, you certainly should say it when you see a beautiful woman. So I'll leave it at that. I thought I'd, make it a little bit more interesting. But there's actually more to say on this specifically. But we'll leave it at that for now. I did, parenthetically, see a beautiful vart from the Meha Shiloach, which is the Ishbitzer. He says, Marabu Masacha Hashem. He says, Kol inyane ha'olam, v'chol ha'nivraim maskirin la'adam sheyesh bore. This is something that we all have heard, but I don't think we've ever seen it inside somewhere. It says, everything that God created is a reminder that there's a creator. Right, that people say that they like watching sports. They could see God, watching a baseball game. They could see God when they're skiing. They could see God. All these things that people like to do, you could make a religious experience out of anything. Moshe Kasav, like the Gemara in Brachas Davav says, Kol ha'olam kulo lo nivra ela bishvil zeh. Okay, the whole world was only created for this specific person. That's what the Gemara says. Perish sheyeda that each person should realize in their own way, okay, that there is a creator. And this is the punchline. Every single day, God gives people the opportunity. You walk down the street, you see something that is a little bit funny, a little bit weird, a little bit uncommon, and you remember that there's a God. And that's what this pasuk Marabu Masacha Hashem is all about, is in the eyes of the Ishbitzer, that we are placed every day in situations where God wants us to see something specific, okay, to remind us, again, we can't prove, directly the existence of God. What we could do is see the footprints, right? And the footsteps or the fingerprints that God lays everywhere that we could attribute and say, wow, there must be a God, right? We've spoken about this, various different classes throughout the years about, the Yerushalmi at the end of Kedushin, that everything was created, for us to get benefit from, to realize that, we do see the fingerprints of God everywhere. So that is the discussion of Mamru Basach Hashem, which we only brought up because that's the Rashbam's introduction to the story of Rabbi Bar Chana. Okay, so now we're going to look at the Maharsha. Right? Remember what the Maharsha said? The Maharsha said that Ein Hamikra Yotze Midei Pshuto. Okay, based on the pasuk of Yordei Hayam Ba'aniyot Ose Malacha B'Mayim Rabim Hema Ra'u Maseh Hashem. This is a pasuk, okay, from Tehillim 107. Here's the pasuk. This, by the way, is in. We say this also in davening, but you have to daven nusuch sfard, and it has to be at mincha time. If you've ever been to a sfard minyan mincha, the chazan screams out hodu. So if you ever wanted to know what hodu he's talking about, I think this is the hodu 107. The pasuk says, Yordei hayam ba'aniyos, ose malacha b'mayim rabim. Okay, those who go down to the sea in ships, they ply their trade in the mighty waters. Hema ra'u maseh Hashem. They see the work of God, v'nifla'osav b'mitzula, and his wonders in the deep. Okay, Vayomer Vayomad Ruach Sa'aro Trumum Galav. By his word, he raised a storm wind that made the waves surge. Okay, so there's a lot of descriptive maritime sprach. Okay, in these psukim. Okay, just a couple of notes on these psukim. So I saw. It's hard not to look at these psukim. The Ibn Ezer says, Hema ra'u maseh Hashem. The Ibn Ezer comments that when the pasuk says they see the works of God, ki rega echad yacharit hayam, all you need is one jolt, umiyad yashbichena kirtzono, and then you realize the power of God, right? Think about it. You're on a flight, on a 10-hour flight. Everything is halfway and everything is great. All of a sudden, right, and there's no turbulence, the first really, really bad bump, everybody panics, right? For 5 hours, everyone's great. The very, very first real jolt, people go all nuts, right? All it takes is one moment. That's what the Ibn Ezer is referring to. So what is it about this religious moment? Okay. Look at the Radak. Hema ra'u b'mitzula ba'amkei hayam sham yiru maseh Hashem v'nifla'otav. If you really want to see the wonders of God, you're not going to see it at home in your couch. You have to go to the deep sea. Ki b'dagim hagdolim u'b'rash hayam yakir, with the fish and with the storms and with human nature present. You'll understand ki natan ba'adam chachma v'tachpula la'amod b'mtzula aluchat eitz. We have the power and the understanding to stand on wooden ships, right, on boards. And certainly when there's a storm, at least you're protected. So there's some kind of religious experience that's associated with going in these deep sea ventures. So when I saw this, I immediately came to mind one of my favorite Mishnayos, and we've seen this already. This is, I think, our third time already that we're going to do this Mishnah in 3 years. Okay, this is a Mishnah at the end of Kiddushin, okay, where it talks about the various professions that the rabbi said we should go into and we should not go in. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Hachamarin Ruban Risha'in. The donkey drivers, most of them are wicked people. The Hagamalin Ruban Ksherim, camel drivers are mostly kosher. Hasapanim, the sailors, Ruban Chasidim. A majority of them are Chasidim. Then the famous next line is Tosha Barofim Gehenim, V'akasha Shabatabachim Shutva Shalom Alek. We had a whole shir on that. Not for now. What does Rashi say? Rashi says, why are sailors considered Hasidim? Now, we don't think of Hasidish as sailors per se, but these are, when we say Hasidim, we mean like really, really religious people, not Hasidim today. They can be religious, but it's a different word. You're following at home. So what are these sailors chasadim for? So Rashi says, sheporshin lamakom hasakana. First of all, they're basically taking their lives in their own hands because, right, back then it was considered very dangerous. The tamid hein bira'ada yoter min hagamalim. And there's much more risk and uncertainty than driving in a camel, meaning the actuaries figured out that it's much more riskier to be out in sea on a boat than to be in the Gobi Desert in the middle of nowhere on a camel. That's what Rashi says. I saw a beautiful yachin, right? I had to say this. Oh, Dr. Brazen, okay. Okay. Midasakanta and Mitsuya Yoter Megamal and the Tamid Hen Bepachadu Ada. Okay, so far so good. The Yachin, who's a very famous commentary on the Mishnah, says that they're always scared. Ki ein beinehen lebein hamaves rak keresh dak. The only thing between this sailor and death is a thin board, right? That's one way to look at it, right? It's very poetic. That's the words of the Yachin. Meaning they're out there. It's not like today we're on a yacht. Okay, yachts aren't so right. We won't talk about yachts anymore. But anyways, for the most part, you're out there on a boat, on a pleasure boat, and you're safe. You know, back then, right? It was a sakana you'd ever come home, and of course you're going to be extra religious. Of course you're going to be out there, right? It's like the saying, there's no atheist in a foxhole, right? Of course you're going to be, very, have a religious experience and be a believer because, like the Yachin just said, the only thing between you and drowning is a piece of plywood. So, I think we could, put that, to rest that whole introduction about we have the Ritva we saw the Marabu Masecha Hashem, and then we talked about the boats, why the boats specifically, you have a religious experience. I can tell you personally, the only time I went on a cruise, the first time you ever wake up and you see literally no land around you, there's a little bit of a feeling of what's the word? I'd call it insignificance, right? How tiny you are and how, you see no land and all you are held up, and by this ballast of the boats. And it could be a little, it could be a little moving experience. So I will say that. Just one, following along, and in terms of introductions, I wanted to give just one contemporary version of an introduction, and that comes from Rav Shlomo Gansfried. He is the author of the Kitzer Shulchan Aruch. I think he lived in the last 150 years. So he wrote a parish called the Pnei Shlomo. I'm reading from inside. He says, "Shahamaisim ha'elu enam kipshutan elam mizbaran al pi hadrash v'hasod." Obviously, there's something deeper to these stories. V'hatam shalom v'arad haGemara yoter hevi midivrei haRamchal b'Kuntrus. He quotes the Ramchal, Ma'amar al Haggados, shebetchila haita haTorah ba'al peh v'lo ksuva klal. This is a little bit like we said in the introduction, that it wasn't written; it was all be'al peh ad sherau Chazal shehadoret yordum umismayat hazikar, and we started to lose our memory. V'hasfara mitkatzeret v'chashishu shem yishkachu es haTorah. Right? We spoke about this, that we didn't really want to write down the Gemara, but we had no choice. So therefore, because of Eis Hasos LaHashem, Ul'achar ken ra'u sheyesh lachashosh gam al cheleks sitrei Torah sheishtakach miYisrael. Okay, so we're going to forget all the halachos. So let's ask ourselves, what about if we forgot all the agados? Would that have been a crime? So ach shalo kumo sha'asu b'niglos haTorah l'kotvam she'ein bo hezek ma shenichtav l'kol koreh. So it's not going to be as bad. However, chashashu Chazal b'sitrei Torah she'im ukasvu v'hiyu le'enei kol yochol lehimase lefi ano shmidot wrote. If we start writing all the Agadata exactly like it was, like we should, it's going to get into the wrong hands. Okay? So therefore, alken nimnu v'gamru lichtov otam shelo yishkuchu b'drachim na'lamos. So we did it ubimine chidot. We did it with riddles, right? This goes back to our Alfonso dude, right? The Portugal Alfonso king, right? So therefore, we wrote it down, but we're not going to write down all the agarata like we wrote down Cheskas Habatim and Hamocharas Abayis, right? We're going to write it in a way like in shorthand with riddles and this and that, and we're going to do it just to get by. So we write it down, but not everybody's going to understand it. And that's the problem. That if people start learning it and don't know what they're reading, they're going to start making fun and it's going to end off bad. So that's so that's in a nutshell the introduction of the Pnei Shlomo. And now with 8.5 minutes left, we could actually begin the class. All right. So let's do a couple of stories. We're going to do the wave story. Okay. We're going to look at Ayin Gimel Amid Aleph. Amar Rabba, Ishtoili Nechuta Yama. Okay. The sailors that went down to the water would tell me, Bengala Lagala Tlasmo Parse. Okay, between one wave and the next are 300 parsas, right? I'm doing this one specifically because this is what the debater, right, back in Portugal in 1460 had a problem with. It says there's 300 parsas between each wave. Veruma de Gala Tlasmo is parse, and not only that, it's 300 parsas high. Zimna Chada Havazlin Ba'orcha says Rabba. Now, this is not Rabba Barchana, this is Rabba. Okay, so Rabba said we were once going. We were traveling along the route and we were lifted up by a wave so high until we saw where the small star resided. Okay, and it appeared to me the size necessary to spread 40 sa'as of mustard seeds. And if we were lifted up, and if we were lifted any higher, we would have been burned by the heat of the star. And one wave spoke to the other wave and said as follows: Chaverti, my friend, did you leave anything in the world that you didn't wash away? That I could come and destroy? Amarle, so the wave said back, Puk chaze gavorta demarech. Okay, so the second wave said, go out and see the greatness of God, to see how great he is. Molo chutachala v'lo avre. Where he said basically, right, there is as much as a string of sand on the land that I can't pass. Okay, it's all under my dominion. Shenemar ha'osi lo tira ne'um Hashem. Okay, so that's a pasuk. So it's funny, we have been talking for 53 minutes and I did not say the word gra so far. You should all know that when it comes to all these interpretations, we spoke about the Ritva and all these introductions, the gra's one of his magnum opus or opuses, I don't know what the plural is a just on Ayin Gimel, Ayin Dalet, Ayin Hey, and Baba Bas, where he wrote a whole interpretation. It was made famous by Feldheim in the 90s, I think, by a book called The Juggler and the King, where he spoke about two famous Agaritas, the one in Baba Basra and the one in Bechoros, Tavches. Okay, that we'll get to in a couple of years, God willing. We'll talk about it then. And the common denominator between all of these 21 or so stories is that the Yam is the world, is our world. We're traveling, and all these things that we're seeing and we're going through our Yetzer Hara, our troubles, are something, right? That's really like when you start plugging in, the keywords, the boat and the wave and the person, right? They're all metaphors for us and our tsaras, our Yetzer Haras, our daigas, our problems, our shortcomings, and all of these stories. I highly recommend you reading that book. It's called The Juggler and the King. Can all be synopsized into that. And just to look at this, story, he talks about it that this is he says Diber be'inyan hagalim shehen miramzin litzaros habaos laolam shekol yom hu yoter mukul mechaveru. Well, I'll talk about a little poignant for today. He says it's like every day is worse than the next, right? That's what our journey in this deep sea is, seeing all these waves. These are our problems. These are our tsaras. Sheyesh liyetzer hara yud beis kochos keneged chodshei hashana ubechol yom holach u'misgaber yoter shiuro k'mo she'adam holach eser parsos biyom, right? And we would go 30 days. I'm sorry, we go 10 parsas a day, so and which are 300 parsas for a month. So he says that our journey, when this Amora, in this case Rabbah, he started to go on his journey. He was lifted up. What does it mean to be lifted up? Obviously, in the eyes of the Gra, he wasn't lifted up literally. Hu hayetzer hara shemagbia la'adam lehisgaos v'lachashov shehu kumo hatzadikim shenimshu l'kochavim. His ego was lifted, and he said, "Wow, I'm like a tzaddik that are compared to stars." So that's what the interpretation is. Very beautiful. V'havilei kemivzre, and it was like 40 saws of mustard seeds. Kumo hatzadik ha'osek b'torah she'oved al yitzro u'machish as kol agufo, like chardol, which is mustard is very bitter. So that's compared to the tzaddik who learns Torah, right? And he's kovesh his yetzer, all right? What does that mean that if we were lifted higher, we would have been burned? Hakavana shegaiva mevia lakas. Okay, gaiva is the prequel to kas. Ubaod kitsas gaiva nisrafen ke'esha kas. A little bit more, and you're going to burn up like anger. Okay, and what does that mean that one wave spoke to the other wave? Kavanato shahagaiva mashchita kol kachet adam. Gaiva, arrogance, kills you. Ad she'ena motira makom lekoach acher sheyesh liyetzer hara lashchito. It leaves you no other room to work, right? It just kills you. Amalei puk chazi gvurte demarech, right? When the story said, is there a sand that I didn't have dominion over? Ha'etza l'natzech et yetzer hara hu lo lahaniach lo b'tchila ligbar alav afilu ma'at, is to nail it, as they say, nip it in the bud. Don't let it get to you even for 1 second. Okay? Kumo shehayam eno yachol ligbar al gvul hayabasha lavar afilu kumalachut. They each have a defining boundary, and once they overlap, it's destruction. Okay, and he goes on to say, he goes on and on. It's 9 o'clock. I apologize. I wanted to do 3 or 4 more stories. We're not going to have time, but all I could say is I highly recommend you read that book. And it talks about, like I said, this one little story is, I'm not sure if anyone in the audience has done all the stories, but I highly, highly recommend it. And, you'll get a lot out of it. Any questions?